There's something about the isolation of camping deep in the wilderness that's both exhilarating and terrifying. That's exactly why my friend Mike and I planned our trip. Just us, a few days in the middle of nowhere, and no one else around for miles. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. We picked a spot that was well off the beaten path, a clearing near a river in a national forest. The drive was long, and the trail leading to the campsite was overgrown. But that's what we wanted. It wasn't an official campground, just a place we'd found online, recommended by a few hardcore camping enthusiasts. No one would bother us out there. The first couple of days were great. The weather was perfect, the views were stunning, and the peaceful quiet of nature was exactly what we needed. We spent our days hiking and fishing, and our nights cooking over the fire, watching the stars. It was everything we had hoped for. Until the third night. That evening, the sky had started to cloud over, and the air was cooler, but nothing that made us worry about a storm. We decided to turn in early, hoping to get a good night's rest before packing up the next morning. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and listened to the sounds of the forest as I drifted off to sleep. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first, just that something felt off. The woods were too quiet. The usual sounds of insects and distant rustling were gone, replaced by a heavy, unsettling silence. I glanced at my watch. It was just after 2 a.m. For a moment, I lay still, listening, trying to figure out what had woken me. That's when I heard it, the distinct crunch of footsteps on the dry leaves outside. At first, I thought it was Mike, but then I remembered hearing his tent's zipper a few hours ago when he'd gone to sleep. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My heart started to race as I realized it wasn't Mike. Someone else was out there walking around our campsite. I lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped, just a few feet away from my tent. I could hear whoever it was breathing heavily, almost like they were standing right over me. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm, praying they'd just walk away. Then, the footsteps started again, moving toward Mike's tent. I wanted to call out, to warn him, but I was frozen with fear. I listened as the footsteps stopped again, right outside his tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. And then, Mike's voice broke through the stillness. "Hello?" he called out, his voice groggy with sleep. "Who's there?" No response. "Hey, if this is a joke, it's not funny," Mike said, a little louder this time. Still, nothing. Just silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and poked my head out, trying to see what was going on. The fire had died down, leaving only the faint glow of embers, but in the dim light I saw it. A man was standing in front of Mike's tent. He was tall, with long, scraggly hair and dirty clothes. His back was to me, but I could see the way he was hunched over, almost like he was listening for something. He didn't move, didn't respond to Mike's voice. He just stood there, staring at the tent. I wanted to yell, to do something, but my throat felt like it was closing up. Who was this guy? How had he found us out here? Just as I was about to make a move, the man suddenly straightened up and turned around, his face catching the faint light from the embers. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and he was grinning, this twisted, unsettling smile that made my skin crawl. He looked right at me, and for a second, I thought he was going to come toward me. But then, without a word, he turned and walked into the woods. Mike unzipped his tent, his face pale. "Did you see that?" I nodded, my hands shaking. What the heck was that guy doing? We both sat there for a moment, too shocked to move. We didn't hear any more footsteps, no sound of him coming back, but we weren't about to take any chances. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mike didn't argue. We packed up as quickly and quietly as we could, our eyes constantly scanning the edge of the woods, waiting for the man to reappear. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us, hiding just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. By the time we made it back to the trailhead and loaded our gear into the car, the sky was starting to lighten. We drove away without looking back. We never did figure out who that man was or how he found us in the middle of nowhere. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe he lived out there. But that grin, those eyes, they still haunt me. It was the last time I ever went camping in a place so isolated. It was early fall, and I had planned a 2-day hike on a trail about 3 hours from where I lived. The kind of trail that cuts through the dense woods and takes you so far from civilization that it feels like the world outside just melts away. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, a little escape from the stress of daily life. The first day of hiking was great. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, the leaves just starting to change. I spent the day walking in peaceful solitude, soaking in the sights and sounds of the forest. By late afternoon, I was about halfway through the trail, which was the perfect spot to set up camp for the night. I found a clearing near a small stream and started setting up my tent. As I worked, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe another hiker, but when I looked up, I saw a man coming toward me. He was walking at a relaxed pace, but something about him immediately felt off. He was wearing clean clothes, like brand new. His shirt didn't have a single wrinkle, and his shoes were spotless. What really stood out, though, was the fact that he didn't have any gear. No backpack, no water, nothing that would indicate he was on a hike. "Hey there," the man called out as he got closer, a friendly enough smile on his face. "Mind if I rest here for a bit?" I hesitated for a second, that off feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. But he didn't seem dangerous, just a little out of place. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. "You lost or something?" He chuckled and shook his head. "No, just out for a walk. Got a little farther than I planned and didn't bring enough supplies. You wouldn't happen to have any spare food, would you?" The polite thing to do was offer help, and besides, I had packed extra MREs. "Yeah, I've got a couple of meals I can spare," I said, handing him one. "You're welcome to camp with me tonight if you want. I've got a tent, and I can sleep in my hammock." His face lit up with a kind of gratitude that seemed genuine. "That's real kind of you," he said, taking the MRE. "I'll take you up on that offer." As the evening wore on, the strange feeling I'd had earlier started to fade. We sat by the fire, eating dinner and talking about hiking, life, and anything else that came up. He didn't seem dangerous, just a little eccentric, maybe. I chalked up his odd appearance to bad planning, assuming he was just an inexperienced hiker who'd gotten himself in over his head. By the time we finished eating, I felt like I'd made a new friend. I let him have the tent, and I strung up my hammock nearby, figuring we'd part ways in the morning. I woke up at sunrise, feeling well-rested. When I peeked into the tent, it was empty. My friend had left early, but he'd left a note behind on the tent flap. "Thanks for the dinner and shelter, but I must be on my way. Safe travels." I shrugged it off, packed up my gear, and started the second half of my hike. It was a quiet, uneventful day, and by late afternoon, I made it back to the trailhead. That's when I noticed something strange. A police barricade at the entrance to the trail. 2 officers stood by, their eyes scanning the area, clearly on high alert. I was confused, but as I approached, they spotted me and immediately turned around, one of them drawing their weapon. "Freeze!" the officer shouted. I stopped in my tracks, holding my hands up in the air. Whoa, I just came off the trail. What's going on?" The officer lowered his gun, clearly surprised. "You've been out here?" "Yeah," I said, lowering my hands slowly. "I was on a 2-day hike. What's all this about?" The other officer stepped forward, eyeing me carefully. "You see anyone out there?" "Yeah," I replied, still confused. "I ran into a guy yesterday, gave him some food, and let him crash in my tent for the night." The 2 officers exchanged a look, their faces growing tense. One of them pulled out a photo and held it up for me to see. Was it this guy? My stomach dropped as I looked at the picture. It was him, the man I'd shared my camp with the night before. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's him. Who is he?" The officer sighed and shook his head. "That man is a convicted murderer. He escaped from a nearby prison 3 days ago." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What?" He seemed normal. He didn't try to hurt me or anything. The second officer stepped forward. "You're lucky. He's been on the run since he robbed a small clothing store and fled into these woods. We've been searching for him, thinking he was hiding out somewhere in the area." I stood there, speechless, the full weight of what had just happened settling in. I had shared food, a fire, and a camp with a convicted murderer. The only reason I was standing there, alive, was because, by some miracle, he didn't see me as a threat. Maybe it was because I had been so oblivious to who he really was, treating him like just another hiker. But now, looking back, I couldn't shake the thought of how close I had come to something far worse. Traveling across the country in a van had always been my dream. The freedom to go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted. No strings, no commitments. It was everything I thought it would be. Thrilling, peaceful, and, for the most part, safe. But looking back, there are moments that remind me just how vulnerable living alone on the road can be. It had been a few weeks since I'd stopped somewhere with proper facilities to freshen up. I was traveling through a remote part of the state, miles from the nearest town, and I desperately needed to clean myself and my clothes. My van, while cozy, didn't have a shower, so when I stumbled upon a riverbank nestled away in a quiet forested area, I figured it was the perfect opportunity to solve both problems. I parked my van at a secluded spot by the river, hidden from the main road by trees and brush. The area felt completely isolated, and I couldn't have been happier to finally have some privacy. I grabbed a small bucket, my soap, and a few garments I needed to wash, stripping down and stepping into the cool, clear water. It felt amazing, refreshing, like washing away the weariness of weeks on the road. As I stood knee-deep in the water, scrubbing my clothes, the midday sun warmed my skin, and for the first time in days, I felt at ease. After washing myself off, I laid my clothes out on the rocks to dry, spreading them carefully to catch the sun. The riverbank was quiet, the only sounds being the gentle rush of water and the occasional chirp of birds. Feeling relaxed, I stretched out on a towel, deciding to take advantage of the sun and tan, a little while my clothes dried. With no one around for miles, I let myself fully relax, soaking in the warmth of the day. Before I knew it, I must have drifted off to sleep. I'm not sure how long I was out. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer. But I woke up to the sound of something strange. It was faint at first, almost like a clicking noise, but unmistakable once I registered what it was. A Polaroid camera. I bolted upright, my heart immediately racing, and scanned the area, looking for where the sound had come from. The sun was still high, casting long shadows from the trees at the edge of the riverbank. My clothes were still spread out around me, but something felt off. I quickly grabbed my towel, wrapping it around myself as I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out what was going on. The wind rustled through the trees, but otherwise, everything was still, until the sound came again. Another click. I spun around, and that's when I saw him. At the tree line, barely 20 feet away, an older man stood, partially hidden behind the brush. He was holding a Polaroid camera, the kind you only see in thrift shops these days, and he was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. It was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. He didn't move, just stood there watching me, camera in hand. I didn't stop to think. I didn't even grab my clothes. I turned and sprinted back toward my van, my bare feet slapping against the ground as I ran. My mind was racing. Who was this guy? How long had he been watching me? The thought of him standing there, taking pictures while I slept, made me feel sick. When I reached the van, I yanked open the door and scrambled inside. My hands were shaking as I locked the doors behind me. I found a pair of shorts and a shirt in the back, throwing them on as fast as I could. My heart was still pounding as I shoved the key into the ignition and floored it, driving away as fast as the dirt road would allow. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, pulling into a gas station where I felt safe enough to catch my breath. The reality of what had just happened started to sink in. I had been alone, completely exposed, with no one around to help if things had gone further. My clothes, my towel, everything I had left behind. It was all still back at the river. I called the local police, explaining what had happened. It felt surreal, describing the man and the sound of that camera clicking in the silence. They told me to meet them back at the river so they could investigate. When I returned with the officer, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the riverbank. We searched the area, but the man was long gone. All of my clothes, the ones I had left drying on the rocks, were missing, completely gone. There wasn't a single trace of the man, no footprints, no sign of where he had come from or where he had gone. But the officer did find one thing. There, tucked between some rocks near the tree line, was a single Polaroid photograph. It was of me, lying on the towel, sound asleep, and written in thick black ink, scrawled across the bottom of the picture, were the words, "Thanks for the show." I never went back to that river, and from that day on, I was never able to relax quite the same way when camping alone. I always felt like someone was watching, even if I couldn't see them. Thanks so much for listening to Nightmare Narratives. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be reminded when we post a new video every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Central Time. If you have a story you'd like to hear read on the channel, email it to us at officialnightmarenarratives@gmail.com, and you might just hear your story featured in a future episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.